So we're back for round three, centralization versus decentralization. We've really enjoyed having this topic. So you are listening to Unlocking the Vault, and we're going to continue with this discussion with regard to centralization versus decentralization. These terms, why do these terms matter to the business? What does it matter to the organization, or if you're in the government, what does it matter to the mission if you're thinking about Department of Defense, intelligence agency type of organizations?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, I don't have all the answers. That's a true statement there, guys. Anyway, sorry. Those of you that know me know I have a dry sense of humor. So I apologize to those of you that don't know me. That was partly a joke and tongue in cheek, but I really don't have all the answers. Otherwise, I'd have nothing left to learn, which is not true. Okay, back to the topic at hand. I'm really trying hard to get you guys to laugh and then hear your laughter during the recording, but that's just not working. All right. So why does it matter to the organization? In the last part, we talked about life and death decisions of a medical record and a medical process and a BI solution that had to be involved in a real-time decision-making set. And you think about centralization and decentralization, it matters to the decision-making process when you set up a system or set up a solution for providing data to certain people. And it's a cross between good governance and knowing where the governance lives and knowing who's making what decision when. To me, that's really the crux of centralization versus decentralization. And let me explain. To me, it doesn't matter anymore because of the advances in technology. And we finished off the last segment with this statement or some of similar statements. To me, it doesn't matter that the technology anymore so much is centralized or decentralized, because to me, it's all hybridized, whether it's in the cloud or not. You don't really know or care, nor should you, whether it's on a single server or whether it's on a clustered server or whether it's split across multiple servers or in one data center or multiple data centers, or whether it scales in real time at the server level. None of that really matters as long as the application works. When I run a SQL statement, do I get the result I need? So that's important. So centralization of the data, what do you need to consider at the organization level? You do need to consider things like global data, whether there are country laws and country regulations in play. That will determine whether or not you can centralize the data itself or whether you have to decentralize the data. But that doesn't tell you whether the BI decision-making is centralized. If you're at the CIO or CTO or CEO level, a decision at that level should be centralized. In other words, you don't want to present two competing answers to the same person at the same time, right? That say two different things. You want a central answer across all your systems. How many customers do we have? Now, I make light of that question because that question has been around since the dawn of data warehousing. How many customers do I have? It seems like such a simple question, but the answer tends to be, it depends. It depends on what you mean by customer. That's a central definition, right? If you're at the C level, CIO level, that means one thing. If you're at the CFO level, that means something else. If you're in sales versus finance at the manager level, it means two different things. So what do you do with centralization of definitions? That's one thing to consider. And then, of course, decentralization. What do you mean if you're in different countries, what is month-end sales number? How is it calculated? If you're in one country, it's calculated one way. If you're in another country, it's calculated a different way. We're talking about regulatory calculations that are given to you by the country's governing body. They say you will calculate this sales number that way for tax purposes. But that's one definition. Can you centralize that across multiple countries? I think the answer is no. So when I say global, these are the kinds of things you need to think about when you're defining centralization. And this is, or decentralization in terms of outcomes, right? There's another category called PII and GDPR. And again, these are all business related decisions. This has nothing to do with the technology underneath or how you implement it or how you get it there. However, it does have everything to do with what's deemed correct or accurate when you deliver the answer using whatever techniques that you use to deliver the answers. So there is something there that you got to think about in terms of how the calculations are going to be run, where they're going to be run, and where the aggregate data sets are going to live. That also plays into centralization and decentralization. Let's take PII and GDPR for a minute. If you think about a European record, there is a European law, and this varies by country in Europe, I've learned recently, and it is changing all the time. So forgive me if I state something I knew 6 months ago, which I'm going to do, and it's already wrong. It may have changed, right? So here's just an example, an anecdotal example. I'm a European citizen and I go on vacation to the US. And I sign a sheet. In the US, I buy something at the Gap, but it's the Gap in the US. It's not the Gap in Europe, right? I go buy a pair of jeans. And at the Gap in the US, they say, sign up, opt in to sign up for this sweepstakes entry. And so you fill in your personal information and you put it on the sweepstakes entry and you think, oh, that would be nice if I win. And then you go back to Europe. You don't win. And then you decide, I don't want the Gap to have my personal information anymore. So you send an email or you send a written request according to European laws, say, please delete all knowledge of me in the US systems because I don't want to be part of the Gap systems. Now you can go after Gap corporate, and this brings to light another question. How do you define centralized data about this individual when you have a clearly decentralized law? The US data has to stay in the US, the European data has to stay in Europe. It was collected on a US system about a European citizen. The European citizen has a right to privacy, to deletion of private information. Okay, wait a minute. Where has this data gone? Has it been delivered to a European system because they're an EU citizen? Are they an EU customer or are they a US customer? Wait a minute. If they buy stuff from the Gap in the European Union, then they're also a European Union customer. Now, this goes right back to the heart of the matter. How many customers do I have? Oh, wait a minute. You're talking about centralization answers at the corporate level. At the corporate level, technically, you have one. You are the same person. You just happen to purchase in 2 different countries. But according to PII or GDPR rules, you have 2. Why? Because you have a US customer that happens to be the same person in real life as the European customer. But because of the laws around decentralization or split data sets, the country laws that require you to keep those data sets separate, you have to adhere to those rules. And so now the question is, how are you going to deal with that in terms of that? Now, Cindi, you've got some information around classification of data and classified systems. I'd love for the audience to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, the only thing I was really going to comment on with regard to that is the fact that when we're looking at, you're talking about privacy, we think about sensitive data and things of that nature. We think about what is available publicly out on the internet versus what might be considered inside a classified network as classified information. And inside of a classified network, or maybe unclassed but sensitive network, the thing that we find is that specific data elements in and of themselves, separated from the rest of the data, are not necessarily sensitive or classified. However, when you work in that sort of arena, if you will, when those data elements come together, their classification level increases. The same is true of public information. You can gather specific public information that seems innocuous on its own, but when put together, it paints a picture of either behavior or personal preferences and things of that nature that could be considered sensitive. So when we talk about decentralized data and centralized data from that perspective, even at the data element, decentralized elements may change classification when they become centralized. So that was what I was thinking when we were talking about data centralization a bit.
That's very cool. And this brings to mind for me a couple of points. I hear a lot of companies say they want to be a data-driven organization.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. I don't think that's all of it. I think in reality, the companies should be a governance-driven organization, or domain and governance driven organization because the data fits into both of those places. And to be a domain driven organization or a governance driven organization, I think you would have better outcomes. But that's just a thought. We're going to let that pass. In terms of that, though, we do at the data vault level, we talk about something called managed self-service BI. And we also split out this concept of data warehousing, which is the word data in it, from information delivery and alignment. What are your thoughts on these two terms, and why are these important to centralization and decentralization?
Well, I think from from a governance perspective, they're very important. Again, data separated on its own may not be sensitive. Data gathered together is sensitive. We think about the term we use in Data Vault with regard to managed self-service BI, again, looking through the concept of a data mesh, if you will, where you have a distributed domain-based data products being produced. I look at that really as it aligns with managed self-service BI, where we're producing data products specific to a domain based on the expertise of that domain, functional area, if you will, group of users. And then we think about what is really being, if you can say, decentralized inside of a mesh. It really comes down to, in my opinion, what's being delivered in the information delivery layer of Data Vault, which I would say could be equated to registering a domain-based data product in the mesh. And then we step back and we say, what pieces should be governed? If we think about if I were to apply a data mesh concept of federated teams and this idea of having collective responsibility, if you will, around the way the mesh is governed, and yet decentralized down where accountability gets pushed down to the domains. That's a form of managed self-service BI information delivery that holds accountability in the domain data product team, and yet has a collective responsibility at the higher level. You could say the centralized level even. There's that prospect. And then the idea of at the centralized level, even inside of a mesh, there's a concept of internal data products. And I often think of those as more or less the common, if you will, main focuses of the business. In the CDVP2 class, we talk about our approach for design is always to start with the business. Always the focus is on the business and grabbing those business concepts. And so from an internal data product that can be consumed by multiple domain-based data engineers, if you will, for data products at the domain level, if we have a clear definition of I would say this centric, which I hate using that word because it's all over the place, but business centric concept, for example, the concept of customer. And when we talk about key process areas inside of the business, when we're discussing how teams should be building and what their focus should be inside of Data Vault, this idea of identifying the business concepts, and at that level, those business concepts that are in particular required for the sustainment of the enterprise. Do we create an internal data product, for example, in the mesh that is well governed centrally and yet can be enriched at the domain level? And I would argue, yeah. And I actually would argue that that falls into a centralized, if you will, approach to data governance for a common business concept that is core to business sustainability versus enrichment at the domain level for specific outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. So to wrap that little bit up, in my mind, Data Vault brings to the table the methodology for how to assemble this and build this and implement this and get this off the ground, right?
Precisely. Yeah.
We talk about managed self-service BI. We define what that is, and then we tell you, here's how you would go about doing that. And we also talk about, and this is interesting to me, you hear about data governance, but how often do you hear about information governance, that needs to be said, right? That needs to be defined. And in the data vault, we make those distinctions in the methodology sense, in the solution. And we talk about how, once again, how to go about building something like that makes those distinctions. We talk about data catalogs. What about information catalogs? So again, terminology, standards, standard definitions, and the points at which you manage centralization versus decentralization are all there. Now, we do bring a series of best practices, which are modifiable by the teams and should be modified to fit within the working culture and the way teams want to process their information and build their systems. And then we have a set of standards which are supposed to be immutable in that type of guideline because they've been tried, tested, and trued up. So they work to support the best practices that go along with this. But this is really what the Data Vault solution and methodology bring to the table.
Yeah,
Now,
Dan, if I may, can I just make one other comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So when you were talking about being a versus a data governance or a governed centric versus a data driven business, more of a data governance driven business, one of the things that I find humorous is the idea of, if you look at the data knowledge maturity pyramid, if you will, data is at the bottom of the pyramid, right? And then after data comes information, and from information knowledge, and from knowledge wisdom. And I kind of laugh to myself when people say they want to be data driven, because why would you want to be at the bottom of the rung? I would rather have my business at least information driven with regard to decision making, not just data driven. I think data can throw us off in certain aspects, but I would be wanting to move up higher up in the rung of that concept of data, information, knowledge, and then toward wisdom. So
yeah, our goal with Data Vault and the methodology is hopefully to get you to a wisdom driven company or enterprise, right? As opposed to, but the wisdom has to be learned and
True.
It just takes time. There's no way around it. That's really a people thing. Okay. So back to centralization, decentralization, all of these decisions have ramifications for shareholders, regulatory bodies, reporting. And I really want to impress upon the listeners, this goes way beyond just the data and the model itself, and even the processes. Centralization and decentralization play a role in all of it, including, as we've been illustrating over the last 2 podcasts plus this one, they go all the way into the methodology, into the solution, all the way up the chain to how you define an artifact or a piece of information that you deliver and what you do with it and your response rates. And so centralization and decentralization really is a core topic that stretches the gambit. And so this is why it's taken us so long to work through all these different pieces. But Cindi, you were talking to me a while ago about data modernization and digital transformation strategies. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about some of that because you caught my attention.
So this is more of my ponderings, if you will, too, about these approaches. We've heard about these for years, and these huge data modernization, digital transformation efforts. And from most of what I read, the strategies really are focused, it seems to be, on the technology. And I just ponder sometimes how much of that strategy really includes an overall methodology or a focus on how teams work, their approaches to data and data governance versus the modernization of the technological platform. To me, it should include all of that. But what I see is that, in at least what I've read and what I hear about, it's really focused on the data and the technology rather than also defining a solid methodology for, if you will, the rollout of that modernization or transformation effort that would ensure that the ways of working, the people and the process pieces are taken into consideration and also, I would say, modernized, moved into this agile approach that is not just pure Scrum, not based on something like Kanban, but embraces more of what we do in Data Vault, which is the disciplined agile approach, which takes a number of different, I would say, methods and approaches, from a DevOps approach to a project-based approach. So it's quite flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we call it Data Vault 2.0 as a solution. right? And it's mainly made up of a methodology. And as I keep saying or alluding to, it's got best practices combined with standards to help all of this stuff get built, right? So the way it gets built. Now, I want to wrap this up for our listeners. This is the end of our conversation, sadly, about centralization versus decentralization. And if the viewers want to know more or the listeners want to know more, then please send us a note on the contact us and tell us what you want to hear about. We're open to ideas and we can dive into specific topics. But the question now is, what impact does the decision on centralization versus decentralization have on the data vault? The answer to that question is basically none, right? It just means that any individual working on data vault solution, systems, methodology, they will understand the bits that should be and can be centralized, along with the bits that should be or can be decentralized. At least that's the hope or the premise, right? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. So you can teach these folks going through class how this all should flow, but whether or not they choose to exercise that is in their own right. In other words, who does what, where, and when needs to be decided by the organization. And we hope that the listeners understand there's a need for enterprise-based governance that is then distributed across the multiple teams for implementation. And that's where some of the best practices should come out. That's where the enterprise architecture should come from. So there should be still some sense of centralized governance, and centralized in a logical sense. So your workers may be remote, but they're centralized in their thinking. They work together as a team to produce an enterprise value statement or set of value statements that then the workers and the teams underneath go and build. And that's where you get the distributed sense of the word. So how to respond to situations alongside of escalation procedures when things go wrong, mitigation strategies. We talked about division of work. We talked about decision-making on the ground at the time of paramedics arriving and all that, as well as understanding the implications of aggregating data. We talked about classified data to specific levels, and when certain aggregations or certain combinations of data, all of a sudden now it's classified or now it's private because you included this thing. So decentralized views and vulnerabilities, someone seeing the data at an aggregate level, just because they have privileges to see the data at a low level, you now need to think about governance at an aggregation level too, and figure out where that fits. And again, just to wrap this all up, what does that have to do with Data Vault? Data Vault solution, Data Vault 2.0 solution brings to the table suggested best practices in the ways of working, in the ways teams should be set up, in the ways all of these prescriptive methodologies should be applied. And they work well with the data mesh concepts in the distribution, and that's the implementation level. So that's where we get the standards and the best practices that all combine to give you a groundswell in a successful deployment. So with that,
I have a question before you cut out. We've been talking a lot over these last 3 series about, data mesh. I'm really curious whether the audience would like us or love us perhaps to actually do a whole series on data vault alignment and how data mesh aligns to data vault. I think that's something interesting. We've been around for 20 years. So where are these, integration points, if you will, and how can data vault assist when people begin to wrap their heads around the theory of a data mesh? I'm curious, would anyone like to, put it out on datavault.com under contact us. I'd love to hear back from you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Datavaultalliance.com is the website for us. Datavault.com will reach us as well. But definitely contact us. Let us know. And with that, I'm Dan Linstedt.
And I'm Cindi Meyersohn.
We'll see you in the next podcast. Take care.